I always loved the idea of spending a weekend alone in a cabin. When I found one to rent deep in the woods, I jumped at the chance. It was supposed to be a peaceful escape, a break from my busy life in the city. I arrived on a Friday afternoon. The sun was setting behind the trees, casting long shadows over the gravel driveway. The cabin was small but cozy. It had a fireplace, a little kitchen, and a loft bedroom. I unpacked my things, made a quick dinner, and settled in for the night with a book. At first, the quiet was nice. I could hear the wind moving through the trees and an owl hooting in the distance. As the night went on, the quiet started to feel creepy. Every creak of the cabin sounded louder in the silence. I kept telling myself it was just the old wood settling, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I went to bed early, hoping a good night's sleep would help. I woke up in the middle of the night to a noise outside. It sounded like something heavy moving through the bushes. I got out of bed and looked out the window. In the dim moonlight, I could just make out a figure near the trees. It was too dark to see clearly, but it looked like a man. I told myself it was probably just a hiker or a hunter, someone who had gotten lost. But the figure didn't move, and the longer I watched, the more scared I felt. I forced myself to go back to bed, pulling the covers over my head like a child. The next day, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. I decided to go for a walk to clear my mind. The woods were beautiful in the daylight, and I started to feel a bit silly for being so scared the night before. But as I walked, I found tracks in the dirt, leading away from the cabin. They were human tracks, deep and fresh. I followed them for a while, but they veered off into a thicker part of the woods. I decided to turn back, not wanting to get lost. When I got back to the cabin, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was a footprint on the porch, just outside the door. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept the lights on and a knife by my bed. Around midnight, I heard the noise again. This time, it was closer, right outside the window. My heart pounded in my chest as I crept to the window and looked out. The figure was back, standing just a few feet away. I could see him clearly now, a man with a scraggly beard and dirty clothes. He was staring right at me. I panicked, grabbing my phone to call for help. But there was no signal. I was alone. I decided to confront him, grabbing the knife and opening the door. But when I stepped outside, he was gone. I stood there, knife in hand, my breath coming in short gasps, feeling both foolish and terrified. The next morning, I packed up and left as quickly as I could. I never looked back. I reported the incident to the rental agency, but they said no one had ever had any problems there before. Maybe it was just a drifter passing through, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly avoided something terrible. Back in the city, I tried to put the weekend behind me. But sometimes, late at night, I hear noises outside my window. When I look out, I swear I see that same figure, standing just a few feet away, staring at me. I moved to get away from him, but what if he followed me? What if he's still out there, watching and waiting? The sun was setting when I decided to hike a new trail in the nearby mountains. I always loved finding new paths, getting away from the busy city life. The trail was new to me but well marked, winding through thick woods and over rocky hills. The air was cool and fresh, just right for a late afternoon hike. As I climbed higher, the path got narrower and rougher. Shadows grew longer, making the forest seem darker and more eerie. I kept moving, eager to reach the top before it got dark. I quickened my pace, driven by the sinking sun and the urge to see the view from the summit. I finally reached a clearing that gave me a breathtaking view of the valley below. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, and for a moment, I lost track of time. The beauty was captivating. But as the last light faded, I knew I needed to head back. Getting down would be tricky in the dark. I turned to go back, but the trail looked different in the dim light. I couldn't find the path markers. My heart started to race as I wandered in what I hoped was the right direction. The forest, which had felt peaceful earlier, now felt oppressive. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, made me jump. I told myself it was just the wind or small animals. As I continued, the ground got tougher. I slipped on loose rocks and had to grab tree branches to keep from falling. My legs were getting tired, and the cold night air was creeping through my clothes. I checked my phone for the time and saw the battery was almost dead. I needed to find my way back quickly. I stumbled upon an old, overgrown trail. It wasn't the one I had taken earlier, but it was better than wandering aimlessly. I followed it, hoping it would lead me back to the main path. The trees closed in around me, their branches scratching at my clothes. I pushed forward, trying to stay calm. Suddenly, I heard a low growl. My blood ran cold as I froze, listening closely. The growl came again, closer this time. I slowly turned and saw a pair of glowing eyes staring at me from the darkness. It was a large, wild animal, probably a mountain lion. My heart pounded as I backed away slowly, never taking my eyes off the predator. I remembered reading that making yourself look bigger could stop an attack. I raised my arms and yelled as loudly as I could. The mountain lion hesitated, then turned and disappeared into the shadows. I didn't wait to see if it would come back. I ran, adrenaline pushing me through the forest. After what felt like hours, I burst out of the trees and onto a familiar trail. Relief washed over me as I recognized the path that would lead me back to the trailhead. I kept a fast pace, the encounter with the mountain lion fresh in my mind. The forest seemed less scary now, but I stayed alert, my senses on high. When I finally reached my car, I collapsed into the driver's seat, exhausted but thankful. I had made it out safely. But as I sat there catching my breath, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me. I looked back at the dark trail, and for a split second, I thought I saw those glowing eyes again, just beyond the trees. I quickly started the car and drove away, my heart still pounding. The drive home was tense. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those eyes following me. I knew it was unlikely, but the fear stayed with me. The mountains, beautiful and calm by day, had shown me a darker, more dangerous side by night. Even now, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I can hear a low growl outside my window, reminding me of that close encounter and the wild, untamed world that's always just a step away. I always loved hiking alone. The quiet of the woods, the sound of my footsteps, and the fresh air made it my favorite escape. One day, I decided to try a new trail I found on a website for local adventurers. It was supposed to be a bit challenging but worth it for the views. The first few hours were perfect. The trail was steep and rocky, but I felt great. I reached a small open area and stopped to rest. I drank some water and checked my map. According to it, I was close to a beautiful lookout that offered a wide view of the valley below. As I kept going, the path became less clear. It seemed like fewer people had been this way. Bushes and branches began to block the way, forcing me to push through. The sky started to get dark, even though it was only mid-afternoon. Thick clouds rolled in, and I felt the first drops of rain. I walked faster, hoping to reach the lookout before the rain got heavy. But the trail seemed to disappear. I realized I had lost my way. Panic started to creep in. I tried to go back the way I came, but everything looked the same. The rain became heavier, and the light faded. I kept moving, hoping to find something I recognized. Suddenly, I slipped on the wet ground and fell hard. Pain shot through my ankle. I tried to stand, but it was useless. My ankle was twisted, maybe broken. I was alone, hurt, and lost in the woods with night coming on. I sat down, trying to stay calm. I remembered I had a whistle in my pack, a standard piece of safety gear. I blew it, hoping someone might hear me. The sound echoed through the forest, but there was no response. I repeated this every few minutes, but the only reply was the rain. Hours passed. The rain turned to a light drizzle, but the cold began to seep in. I shivered, my clothes soaked through. I knew I had to save my energy and stay warm, so I pulled out my emergency blanket and wrapped it around myself. I kept blowing the whistle every so often, praying for a response. It felt like forever, but finally, I heard something, a distant sound of footsteps and faint voices. I blew the whistle again, as loud as I could. The voices grew louder, and soon I saw flashlights cutting through the darkness. Relief washed over me as two hikers appeared. They had heard my whistle and come to investigate. They helped me up and supported me as we slowly made our way back to the main trail. Every step was agony, but I was grateful for their help. After what felt like hours, we reached the trailhead. They drove me to the nearest hospital, where I learned my ankle was indeed broken. The hospital staff patched me up, and the hikers who found me left after making sure I was okay. But something about that night stayed with me. As I lay in the hospital bed, I kept thinking about the voices I heard before the hikers arrived. They didn't sound like just two people, but many, and they were too close before the flashlights appeared. When I asked the hikers if they had met anyone else on the trail, they looked puzzled and said they hadn't seen a soul all day. The memory of that night haunted me. The forest felt different now, no longer just a place of peace but something darker, hiding secrets I wasn't meant to uncover. From then on, I never went hiking alone. The wilderness, once my escape, had shown me a side I couldn't forget, a side that made me feel like I was never truly alone out there. I decided to go camping alone in the woods for the first time. I needed a break from city life, and spending a night under the stars sounded perfect. I found a spot near a small, calm lake, surrounded by thick trees. It was quiet and peaceful. After setting up my tent, I gathered some wood and started a campfire. The crackling fire was comforting as the sun began to set. The sky turned shades of orange and pink, reflecting beautifully off the water. I cooked a simple meal and enjoyed the quiet. Everything felt perfect. As darkness fell, I heard the sounds of the forest coming alive. The hooting of an owl, the rustling of leaves, and the distant croak of frogs filled the night. I felt a bit uneasy but told myself it was just the normal sounds of the woods. I sat by the fire, staring into the flames, until I felt tired. I put out the fire, zipped up my tent, and crawled into my sleeping bag. The night was cooler than I expected, and the only light came from the moon shining through the trees. I woke up to a strange noise outside my tent. It was a low, growling sound, unlike anything I had ever heard. My heart raced. I lay still, listening closely. The noise continued, getting closer. I could hear the crunch of leaves underfoot. Something big was moving outside. I quietly reached for my flashlight and my camping knife. My hand shook as I turned on the flashlight. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but I couldn't see anything unusual. The sound stopped. I strained my ears, trying to hear any movement, but there was only silence. After what felt like forever, I slowly unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The night was still and quiet again. I felt a mix of relief and lingering fear. I decided it was probably an animal, and that I was overreacting. I closed the tent and lay back down, but sleep didn't come easily. Every little sound seemed louder, keeping me on edge. Eventually, I got so tired that I fell into a restless sleep. When I woke up the next morning, sunlight was streaming into the tent. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside carefully. The area around my campsite looked undisturbed, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling from the night before. I packed up my gear, ready to leave the woods. As I was folding my tent, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were large footprints in the dirt, much larger than any human or common animal. They led away from my campsite and into the deeper parts of the forest. I decided not to stick around to investigate further. I finished packing and hiked back to my car as quickly as possible. The whole way back, I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. When I finally reached my car and locked the doors, a wave of relief washed over me. I drove away from the woods, vowing to never camp alone again. The peace and quiet I had wanted turned into a night I would never forget, a reminder of how small we are in the wild. I made it home safely, but the memory of that night stayed with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever made those footprints was still out there, watching. From then on, I always made sure to camp with friends, never alone. Nature is beautiful, but it has its own rules and dangers. Sometimes, when I lie in bed at night, I can still hear those footsteps crunching in the leaves. I wonder if it followed me home, waiting for the right moment to remind me that out there, in the dark, I'm never truly alone. I had always enjoyed hiking, so when I came across a trail that promised amazing views and complete isolation, I was eager to check it out. The trailhead was peaceful, the air fresh, and I felt a rush of excitement as I stepped into the dense forest. The first hour was stunning. Sunlight streamed through the trees, creating patterns of light and shadow on the ground. I followed the path as it twisted deeper into the woods, relishing the quiet. But as I continued, the trail became harder to see, choked with brambles and thick bushes. I kept going, thinking it was all part of the adventure. The forest noises, the chirping birds and rustling leaves, were calming. Then, without warning, everything went silent. The sudden quiet was unsettling, and I felt a cold shiver that had nothing to do with the temperature. I began to lose my sense of direction. I had been careful to mark my path, but now I couldn't find any of my markers. Panic set in as the trees seemed to close in on me. I tried to turn back, but every direction looked the same. My heart raced as I realized I was lost. Hours passed, and I stumbled through the thick underbrush, every step feeling heavier. I was exhausted, and the sky had turned a gloomy gray. My phone had no signal, and hope was slipping away. My mind ran through worst-case scenarios, but I forced myself to stay focused. I had to find a way out. Then I saw something strange, a faint trail of disturbed leaves. It was a small sign, but it was the only clue I had. I followed it carefully, pushing through the dense vegetation. The trail led me to a small clearing where I found an old, abandoned ranger station. It was creepy, but it offered some shelter. I hesitated for a moment before going inside. There, I found a dusty map and an old radio. I wiped off the map and studied it, realizing the ranger station was marked on it. I plotted a route back to the main trail and hoped it would guide me to safety. As darkness fell, I used the radio to call for help. The response was quick. When the rescuers arrived, I was relieved to see them. They led me out of the forest, and I felt a wave of relief as I finally emerged into the open. But the feeling of relief didn't last. The forest had tested me in ways I hadn't expected, and as I drove away, I glanced back at the dark woods. I noticed something unsettling. There was a figure standing near the edge of the trees, watching me. I couldn't make out any details, but it was clear that I was not alone. The thought of that figure lurking in the darkness, waiting silently, left me with a cold, uneasy feeling that wouldn't go away. The forest had been more than just a place of nature. It had held something far more sinister, and I couldn't shake the sense that whatever it was might still be out there, waiting for its next chance. I've always loved the idea of a cabin in the woods. The thought of getting away from the city noise and spending a weekend surrounded by nature was something I often dreamed of. So, when I found a cheap rental online, I jumped at the chance. The drive up was peaceful. The trees lining the road got thicker as I got closer. By the time I reached the cabin, it was late afternoon. The sun was casting long shadows, and the air was fresh and cool. The cabin had a small porch and a single rocking chair. It looked perfect. After unpacking, I decided to take a walk around the area. There was a narrow path leading into the woods, and I followed it for a while, enjoying the sounds of birds and rustling leaves. As I walked, I noticed a faint smell of smoke in the air, but I brushed it off, thinking it was probably from another cabin nearby. When I got back, it was getting dark, so I made myself some dinner and settled down with a book. The quiet was nice, and soon I felt sleepy. I decided to turn in early. I woke up in the middle of the night to a strange noise. It was a faint, steady tapping sound, like something hitting the side of the cabin. I sat up and listened, my heart pounding. The noise continued, steady and unchanging. I tried to tell myself it was just a branch knocking against the wall, but it was too regular for that. I got up and grabbed a flashlight. As I walked through the small living room, the tapping grew louder. I took a deep breath and opened the front door, shining the light outside. The beam of the flashlight revealed nothing unusual, just the dark outline of trees. The noise stopped all of a sudden, and an eerie silence fell over the woods. Feeling nervous, I went back inside and locked the door. I returned to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the cabin seemed louder in the stillness of the night. Eventually, I got tired enough to fall asleep. The next morning, I stepped outside to look around. In the daylight, everything seemed normal. I walked around the cabin, checking the walls, but found nothing that could explain the tapping. I shook off the uneasy feeling and decided to go for another hike to clear my head. The day passed without anything weird happening, and by the time evening came, I was feeling more relaxed. I cooked dinner, read for a bit, and then decided to call it a night. Once again, I woke up to that same tapping sound. This time, it was louder, more insistent. I grabbed the flashlight and my phone, then crept to the front door. I hesitated before opening it, bracing myself for whatever might be out there. As soon as I opened the door, the tapping stopped. The silence was almost overwhelming. I shined the flashlight around, but there was nothing. I stepped outside, feeling the cool night air. Suddenly, I heard a rustling sound from the bushes nearby. My flashlight caught a pair of eyes reflecting back at me. I froze. It was a deer. The animal stared at me for a moment before running off into the woods. I let out a shaky breath, relieved but still on edge. I went back inside, locked the door, and decided I would leave first thing in the morning. The following morning, as I packed up my things, I felt a sense of urgency. The cabin, once a place of peace, now felt unsettling. I loaded my car and took one last look at the place before driving away. As I reached the main road, I glanced back at the cabin one more time. It stood there, quiet and calm, but I knew I wouldn't return. The woods held their secrets, and I was happy to leave them behind. I later learned that the area had a history of wildlife encounters. The rhythmic tapping? Most likely the work of a woodpecker, and the strange sounds at night could have been any number of animals. But as I lay in bed that night, back in the safety of my apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me, something that wasn't a deer or a bird. And then I remembered that faint smell of smoke from my first walk. I found out later that there had been a fire in those woods years ago. A fire that had taken the lives of several campers. Maybe it was just my imagination, but as I drifted off to sleep, I thought I heard that steady tapping once more, coming from the window just behind my head. The hike had been easy so far, just a calm walk through thick woods. The sun was setting, casting long shadows as I kept going. Today, I'd decided to try a less traveled path, one I'd read about but never been on. It promised great views and peace, which is what I wanted. As I walked, the forest got darker even though the daylight was fading. The trees were closer together here, their branches weaving into a thick cover. The chirping of birds had disappeared, replaced by occasional rustling in the bushes. I stopped for a moment to check my map. I was off the main route but still on a marked trail. I told myself not to worry. I moved on, my footsteps crunching on the fallen leaves. The trail started to slope down, and I saw a faint, unmarked path leading off to the side. My curiosity got the best of me, so I decided to see where it went. It looked like it might lead to a good view. The path was narrower and overgrown, but it seemed to open up ahead. As I went further, the trees grew thicker and the shadows deeper. I heard something, a low, rhythmic thudding. My heart raced. I stopped and listened, but the sound was gone. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just my imagination. I reached a small clearing, and in the middle was an old wooden box. It was half buried in leaves and looked out of place. I approached carefully and opened it. Inside were a few rusty tools and some old, yellowed papers. One of the papers looked like a log, filled with strange symbols and notes. There was also a faded photo of a man with a serious face. I shivered but told myself it was just the cold. When I turned to leave, I noticed that the path I had taken had vanished. The trees seemed to have closed in around me. I tried retracing my steps, but there was no sign of the trail. Panic set in. I pulled out my phone, but there was no signal. I had no choice but to keep moving forward. Hours passed. The light was almost gone, and I was stumbling through the underbrush, branches scratching my skin. The thudding sound came back, louder and closer. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding. I needed to get out of there. Finally, I stumbled onto a wider trail. My legs were sore, and I was covered in scratches and dirt. I followed the path, which led me back to the main trail. Exhausted, I made my way to the trailhead, where my car was parked. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something in the dark trees behind me. There was nothing but the black forest. I told myself never to stray from the path again. The experience had left me shaken, but what really unsettled me was the sound I heard when I finally got home. As I unloaded my gear, I noticed my phone had a new notification. It was a photo of me, taken in the clearing, with the old wooden box in the background. I hadn't seen anyone else there. I didn't remember anyone being near me at all. I felt a chill run down my spine. Whatever was out there, it had been watching me the whole time. The sun was starting to set as I began my hike along the trail through the thick forest. I had been excited about this solo hike for weeks, but as the light dimmed, an unsettling feeling started creeping in. The trees, old and dense, seemed to whisper with the wind, and shadows grew longer with each passing minute. I planned to follow the trail for a few hours and then head back before it got dark. The path was clearly marked, and I felt confident with my map and compass. The crunch of leaves beneath my feet and the occasional call of a distant bird were my only sounds. But as the sky turned deep orange, something didn't feel right. I noticed that the trail markers seemed different from what I remembered. The blazes on the trees, usually bright and clear, were now faded and uneven. I checked my compass and map, but everything seemed correct. I brushed it off, thinking it was just the fading light. As it got darker, I turned on my headlamp and picked up the pace. My heart started racing as the forest seemed to close in around me. The trees were so close together now that it was hard to see more than a few feet ahead. The only sound was my breathing and the occasional snap of a twig. Then I saw something that made my skin crawl. A small, makeshift campfire pit with some smoking embers. Nearby, a ragged jacket hung from a branch, flapping a bit in the breeze. At first, I thought someone else was out here, but as I looked closer, I saw the jacket was old and filthy. It didn't look like it had been used recently. I decided to move on quickly, but then I saw something in the underbrush, a pair of muddy, oversized boots. They were left in a hurry, soles facing up, and looked like they had been thrown away in panic. My gut told me something was wrong. I tried to ignore the growing fear and pushed forward. I finally reached a small clearing where the trees opened up to a view of the distant town lights. Relief washed over me, but it didn't last. As I took a deep breath, I realized the trail markers were gone. The path I had been following had vanished, leaving me stranded with no clear way back. Panic set in. I turned back the way I had come, but the darkness and the unfamiliar terrain made everything look different. I felt like I was walking in circles. My phone had no signal, and I was alone with no way to call for help. Just when I was about to give up, I saw a faint light approaching from the opposite direction. My heart pounded as I saw a figure coming through the trees. It was another hiker, looking as startled as I was. They had a map and a compass, and together, we tried to find our way back to the main trail. Back at the trailhead, I learned from the rangers that there had been reports of trail markers being messed with recently. Someone had been deliberately confusing hikers. My blood ran cold as I thought about how close I had come to getting lost forever. The thought of being out there alone for much longer, possibly meeting whoever was messing with the trails, made my skin crawl. The idea that someone might have been watching me from the shadows all along was a chilling thought that kept me up for days.